All right. So, Salih Hudayar, thank you for taking.
Hudayar.
What?
Hudayar.
Hudayar.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with me. You are one of the most prolific voices in the Uyghur movement, especially when it comes to representing the desire to not be dominated and controlled by another country. You describe yourself as a refugee of your home of East Turkestan. Today, that is called the Autonomous Region of Xinjiang. Can you give me a little bit of background on your history, what made you a refugee, and why you can't go home anymore?
Yes. In the 90s, I was born. First, I'll explain a little bit about myself. I was born in East Turkestan in the city of Atush, which is about 40 minutes northwest of Kashgar, near the Kyrgyzstan border, about 100 miles from the Kyrgyzstan border. It's a predominantly Uyghur town. Um, So I was born in May of 1993 to a Uyghur family. Um, my father, I didn't meet my father until I came to the United States, so I'll give you a little bit more on why on that. Um, so I was born into a Uyghur family in Atush in 1993. And growing up in Atush, my family historically we've kind of resisted against the Chinese various Chinese regimes that tried to dominate East Turkestan. I was named after my great grandfather Salih Ajbai. He's one of the wealthiest Uyghurs in my town at the time. He was executed in 1952 as a so-called counter-revolutionary capitalist. And this was just a term that the Chinese government would throw to, before to demonize anyone that they were going to persecute. Um, so I growing up in East Turkestan, I didn't really know much about our political history. All I knew was that we were different. In Atush, there's no at that time there was like literally no Chinese in Atush at that time. In the 90s. The only Chinese there would be the Chinese government officials and the Chinese military that you would see occasionally, like once a week or once every other week, parading, through the streets to present their show of force as they obviously as they regularly do. All I knew was from hearing conversations growing up with the elders. You would hear them talking about, oh, if it hadn't been for the Russians, we would have been the Soviets. If it hadn't been for them, we would have been free. If they hadn't screwed us, um, we would be a free nation too. Like these things. My first encounter with the Chinese government, military, occupation forces was, I believe, in 1997. This or possibly late 1997, possibly 98. It was after China launched the so-called strike hard campaigns and to suppress our resurging independence movement. So after the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of the Central Asian republics, a lot of our people inside and outside East Turkestan, we began pushing for our right to self-determination, and China began to crack down on this. First, they initiated in 1996. They initiated document number 7. So the top leaders, Politburo Standing Committee of the CCP, they held a top secret meeting in Beijing on the so-called stability maintenance of East Turkestan, what they call Xinjiang, and they highlighted that so-called national separatism was the biggest threat to China's control over East Turkestan and China's overall. Um, so they issued a 10-point directive. This was in March 1996, which specifically, that laid down the foundations for the genocidal policies that we see today. Um,
This is probably a good time frame too to jump in because the
yeah,
Uyghur refugees I speak to generally had to flee their homeland in the late 90s, early 2000s, because that is when the most protests were going on. That's when protests started to erupt to be more violent too. So this is when you get the basis of one China policy. And for me, that is a very interesting dynamic because it seems to be a wrestle between the Chinese government that wants to completely expel any idea of separate identity from China. And that seems to be where you come into the picture is, you're protesting, you don't want to have, you don't consider yourself Chinese from what I understand. So the idea of a law that says you have to only speak language that promotes your Chinese identity. What's that like? I mean, if you don't feel Chinese, but there's a law in your homeland that says you can't talk about not being part of China, that's got to be a complicated dynamic, to say the least.
It is a very complicated dynamic. The fact that if you say you're not Chinese, you're viewed as back in the early like 1950s, right after China took over East Turkestan, they would label anyone who demanded, independence, who demanded that, China leave that the Chinese colonists leave East Turkestan, as so-called as anti, as counter-revolutionaries and so-called ethnic nationalists or um, uh, things like that, counter-revolutionaries, separatists, etc. These were the terms. Then throughout the 90s, that was the term as well. National separatists was the term that they would label us. And then, as you know, after 9/11, it became so-called terrorists because majority of our people are Muslim, and China has used the ongoing the launch of the global war on terror as as a weapon to demonize our entire right to self-determination and independence. So in 1996, so one of the things that they do after this, passing document number 7, it's the 10-point directive. One of the directives, Directive 8, specifically calls, in addition for, targeting our culture, language, etc. One focuses on the international community, and they state that they need to, co-opt Western governments or governments like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkey. Um, they need to use propaganda to essentially demonize our movement, to suppress our movement, and use all means necessary to prevent the internationalization of the East Turkestan problem, including infiltrating our diaspora communities and organizations. And then using all means to fight against the remaining so-called small number of unwavering separatists or whatever like themselves. Like for example, I don't consider myself a separatist. We are not separatists because historically, if you look even before really up until 1949, if you look at maps, we were always separate from the so-called China. China lies within the Great Wall, like, and the furthest extent of the Great Wall is at the Jiayu Pass. That's been how China has been for thousands of years. East Turkestan is not China. The fact that they had to rename it to Xinjiang, which in the Chinese language, the modern translation is the new territory or new frontier or new dominion. But if you look at the 1892 English Chinese dictionary, the word colonize and colony would translate as Xinjiang. So that's a fact that the Chinese can't deny. Even when they gave us autonomy, so-called autonomy in 1955, if you look at um, the Chinese government's own statements from that time, this is not a new problem that just happened over the past few years or the past few decades or after the fall of the Soviet Union. If you look at what the Chinese were saying, they unilaterally declared East Turkestan as as the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but by 1957, our leaders in East Turkestan, our people were pushing back against that and saying, no, we don't want your fake autonomy. We want to restore our independent East Turkestan Republic, because that's what we had twice in the 21st century. We declared our independence as the East Turkestan Republic, the first time in 1933 to 34, and due to Soviet intervention, it was overthrown. The second time in 1944 until the Chinese Communist occupation in 1949. And so the root of the problem that nobody is really talking about is like, oh, these are ethnic minorities. These are, why is China doing this, or China them because of their religion. All of this is incorrect. The root is Chinese colonization occupation. In 1949, there was not even 200,000 Chinese, and that 200,000 Chinese were Chinese soldiers and their families and officials sent to help turn East Turkestan into a so-called socialist society. Then they were supposed to leave, but after 5 years, and then 1955 came, and they're like, "Oh, we're going to give you autonomy." By 1958, the Chinese grew from less than 4% in 1949 to over 8%. And the Uyghurs at that time, we were over 85%, of the population in 1958. In 1949, we were over 90% of the population, with other Turkic peoples making up the other portion, to where we were over 96% native population. Today, you look at the demographics that have shifted over the past 75 years. We have went from the Uyghur population went from over 90% to roughly about, what if we take what the Chinese government's statistics is true, if we say that's true, to less than 45%. Whereas the overall native population went from over 96% to less than 58, 59% today. Whereas the Chinese went from less than 4% to over 40%. And that is the root of the problem that nobody is talking about, is the fact that it's everything that we are suffering is because of Chinese colonization and occupation of East Turkestan. So after 1996, document number 7, they launched the first so-called Strike Hard campaign. Even their ongoing genocide that they're waging right now, they call it a so-called Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism, etc., or the People's War. So that was the first. So this led to tens of thousands of our people getting arrested. Anyone that they deemed, was a so-called separatist, they raided our home, because someone caught one of my uncles reading a book about our history, and so because of that, he was arrested. My father had already fled in 1995 to Central Asia, neighboring Central Asia, because he was involved in some protests in East Turkestan in 1995. So after that, he fled. So I didn't know my father, growing up, I didn't know my father until I came to the U.S. By 1999, China began to intensify it. They've pretty much co-opted the other governments across the border in Central Asia to, suppress our movement there as well. And so we had no choice but to, everyone had no choice but to start trickling out into the West. That's when Uyghurs started moving out into the West. Before that, it was just focused on neighboring countries.
And I kind of,
My father, my
oh,
father
yeah.
ended up in the U.S. in 1998. Then in 2000, after like 2 years, with the help of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, we were able to get a political refugee here in the U.S.
Well, I think that's brings us to today. Your father in the late 90s, 2000s comes here as a refugee. You're coming here as a refugee. And this is kind of where this map behind you gets into play here, because now we've covered through the history of the first 60, 70 years after Chairman Mao decides he wants to industrialize this region. We get to the 2017 anti-terrorism law in Xinjiang. And that law, from what I can tell, has been the most oppressive in regards to sectioning out illicit media, and ensuring if you go to a funeral, there's restrictions legally on what you can say at that funeral. Even defacing money would be a crime under some of these laws in Xinjiang right now. This is where we get to what is now the national debate of genocide, cultural genocide, and mass encampments of hundreds of thousands of people. I believe Amnesty International right now says it's at 500,000, which is the lowest number. So this is where I think now people want to know, where does this movement go? You bring up a very good point that this is cultural colonization. Clearly, you are an indigenous people being dominated by the Chinese, but they're also doing pretty successfully, just as America did in the United States. And we were pretty harsh to those who we colonized and forced them to adapt into our society. And even today, as I fight for indigenous rights, it's in the context of the American empire. What is the future for your people? And can you tell me a bit more about that vision and where you're wanting to go? Because it's a pretty dark situation right now for your people.
Yes, briefly, I just want to highlight the atrocities. For example, that 500,000 number is those who are, quote, legally imprisoned. In fact, China's own judicial data from 2019 showed that they put 578,500 Uyghurs and other Turkic people, sentencing them anywhere from 5 years to life in prison for various crimes. So that is a large number. Just those who have, these are the so-called alleged terrorists or so-called terrorists that China demonizes us as. When you have 600,000 of your people who are imprisoned from 5 years to life, that there's a much bigger problem. Given the fact that despite that East Turkestan doesn't even make up 2.5% of the so-called PRC, we have just in the legally, quote, legally imprisoned population is over 30% of the over 35% of the total imprisoned population, legally imprisoned population in China. So there's a big problem here. Secondly, the Chinese government's own white paper, initially it denied, it called these vocational training centers that were, they're re-education schools. And then after some international attention in 2020, in September, they released a white paper stating that these are vocational training centers and that they were providing jobs and job opportunities and language skills to the Uyghurs, and that they sent, their own white paper confessed that they sent 1.29 million people per year from 2014 to the end of 2019, or roughly 7.8 million people. So 7.8 million of our people have been thrown into these concentration camps, which China calls re-education camps. In addition, China's own educational data shows that prior to, like, up until 2019, and it's still ongoing, we estimate it's gone to over a million, but they stated at that time some 890,000 Uyghur children have been taken from their families and put into state-run orphanages and boarding schools to be educated as loyal Chinese citizens. And what are they dressing them up as? Like the Chinese parade it. They don't even hide it anymore. If you look at Chinese social media, Douyin, you'll see Uyghur children, little Uyghur children who are dressed up in Chinese PLA, mini Chinese PLA uniforms, and vowing to become defenders of the Chinese motherland and fighting against the terrorists and so-called enemies of China, meaning their own people. When they ask them to try to speak their own language, they don't know how. The Chinese are like, oh, here, can you speak any Uyghur? The kid doesn't know how to speak it. This is the scale. Hundreds of thousands of our women have been sterilized. The Chinese government's own data shows that since 1989 up until 2009, and after that it grows even worse, that they prevented, quote, 3.7 million illegal births among so-called ethnic minorities, meaning non-Chinese peoples in East Turkestan alone.
Wow.
So
What's an illegal
we
birth?
estimate, yeah, Forced abortions is the term. They forcibly
Wow.
aborted 3.7 million of our babies.
Because if they would have
So
been born, that would have been
yeah,
considered an illegal. Was that under the one-child policy at that time?
I mean, even under the one child policy, even now it's the same thing. For
Hmm.
example, for my hometown, they put a 0% growth rate. This has been in place since 2018. A 0%, no growth for these people. We have the largest. If you go over, my town is split into two parts in by mountain range. On the other side, there's a massive prison complex that holds anywhere from 40 to 50,000 people. There's seven concentration camps and four prisons in my four large prisons in my hometown alone. And this is just talking about my hometown, which the Chinese state has a population of roughly 3 to 400,000 people. So the scale is unprecedented. The Chinese government is also expanding organ harvesting centers or voluntary organ donation, organ transplant centers. Again, quote voluntary. There's nothing voluntary about it. In our from a religious perspective, you're not supposed to give up your organs. Just and if you ask any Muslim that, you can understand that. But the fact that they're expanding this shows that they're killing our people. Because a lot of people, like I had four relatives that we know that were confirmed dead, that died in the camps and prisons, but their bodies haven't been returned to our families. So what is happening? They're cremating it. They're taking their organs. They've built also a lot of cremation facilities in East Turkestan, stating that they're going to crack down on illegal religious burial sites, and now they're burning our bodies, even our the cemeteries, hundreds of years old cemeteries, including recent cemeteries, are being bulldozed and replaced by whatever the Chinese, colonists decide to put on there. So even our deceased, uh, the evidence that they existed are being removed as well. So just calling it human rights atrocities or cultural genocide is does injustice to the reality.
Right. And usually this is where I have the most difficulty in this conversation because I believe everything you're saying. I've read the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch reports. Those organizations I trust a lot, and they have been very honest in reporting on a lot of that you're talking about, and I recommend anyone go read that. However, in my community, there are a lot of those who don't believe that. They read other news sources, especially those coming out of Breakthrough News, one of those organizations funded by the People's Forum in New York. And there are many New Mexicans I know who would say everything you are telling me right now is to some extent propaganda, anti-Chinese propaganda from the West, meant to sow chaos and separatism in a country that needs to be strong. There seems to be a very incredible disconnect where when I talk to Uyghurs, they can't speak to their family members. They don't know where they've gone to. They don't have access to lawyers. That's very unusual. And now you're telling me you have four family members whose bodies you were not able to receive. You don't know really what happened to them. They were taken away and then they were gone. That's terrifying. And I can't empathize enough with you about what that experience is like. So how is it that you can tell me about genocide happening to your people, but yet people in my own city, in my community, they're on a completely different page. They call you a CIA operative. How does that work?
Well, that's because of Chinese propaganda. The Chinese government has effectively spent billions, tens of billions of dollars on, propaganda. They have a entity called the United Front Work Department, which has an annual budget of $12 billion a year. That's just one, and that's like an intelligence agency. And what they're tasked with doing is to cultivate, you know, and co-opt other organizations. Sure, and this goes from everything from governments to organizations to the people. China's spending a lot in buying up, influence in terms of tech and media. So you don't hear mainstream media, really talking about our issue because they're afraid of talking about it. or they're afraid of upsetting China, because if you look at it, the few journalists that were able to go, many of them have been banned. The few, academics that wrote the honest truth about what was happening in East Turkestan, they were demonized as anti-China and prevented from, conducting any type of further, research in China. So these are the ways that China silences, journalists and others and co-ops them. Then you have the Chinese, who government bringing in, all these people on tours, foreign influencers, journalists, etc., and they take them only to two locations out of the entire country of 1,828,418 square kilometers, or an area 2.5 times the size of Texas. They take them only to two specific locations, nowhere else. This is the only two places that you can travel to, and this is the happy Uyghurs that you will see. And so what they do is, one, they take you to Urumqi, and what many people don't realize is Urumqi is the colonial administrative capital. The Chinese make up over 80% of the population there. Even in Urumqi, they only take you to the International Grand Bazaar, which is a tourist site. And then there they have people dancing, singing and dancing, wearing doppas. If you look at, yeah, many Western people can't differentiate, because the mainstream media always treats us, oh, these are Chinese Muslims. So in your idea, when you go there, you think, okay, so these people are Chinese Muslims. They're Chinese. They just are Muslim. So this is the thing. So when you have, what the Chinese are doing is they're teaching Chinese, their own people, Uyghurs, giving them Uyghur languages, teaching them to sing and dance. And when these journalists come, or influencers or whatever's come, they'll have these Chinese people who are dressed up in, wearing doppas like mine, who are wearing Uyghur clothing, and saying, when you ask them, how are things, they'll say everything's fine. The Chinese government has brought development, all these different things. And in your mind, they're like, oh, so, this is Western propaganda, what's happening. But here I'm listening to these Chinese Uyghurs, and they're saying everything is great because they're Chinese. They're not Uyghur. That's one fact. Two, the other location is Kashgar. The same thing. In Kashgar, they take you to the new city, again, turned into a cultural, essentially a pumpkin site, like a tourism site. And again, it's the same thing. Singing and dancing, happy Uyghurs, and this is it. If you try to go remotely anywhere, they'll follow you and they'll prevent you, saying you need a special pass. There are a lot of other people, influenced and others, who went on their own, and especially Muslims, from other countries who were skeptical. They went and they found out many of the mosques have been torn down. All of the mosques are closed. Every time they try to go there and they're like, oh, we want to see if there's prayer, they're like, oh no, the prayer time is not now. And they're like, what the heck? I'm a Muslim. I know what time the prayer time is. So what's going on? When some of them, when they went to actual Uyghurs and started greeting them, and Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you, the Islamic greeting, the Uyghurs, they just turn away and they're like, no, there's the immediate fear on their face, and they're like, no, get away from me. Because again, even the saying Assalamu alaikum is a sign of extremism, which gets you sent into a concentration camp. If you won't see many young Uyghurs in the streets. Why? And everybody's like, why is there not many young Uyghurs in the streets? Why? Because they're the ones that the Chinese government is taking into the so-called, providing them with jobs. That's the excuse they write. We're providing with them with jobs. They're working at factories. Essentially, they're being used as forced labor, and they're taking our population not just into concentration camps in East Turkestan, but also into forced labor factories across China to dilute our population.
So I think the hardest thing to hear, even what you're telling me, is to know you're not able to go to your homeland and advocate for this on your behalf in your home, because being a refugee means you're displaced. And I think you make a pretty terrific argument for what you believe here. And the thing for me is, I also know professors who, in this case, Kenneth Hammond, he is connected to that organization, People's Forum. He's published for 1804 books before. He's written books on China specifically, and he has taught at the School of Marxism in Shandong recently. Now, This is someone who is allowed to go to your homeland where you're not. This is a professor from the United States who goes to your country and says things are okay, and this is his own viewpoints and propaganda, if you will. So the hardest thing for me is when you have two people who have vastly different realities, it's hard to make sense of up and down. For me, I follow this movement a lot, and I think the Uyghurs have a very good argument for cultural genocide and a colonization effort that is unbridled to anything since America. But at the same time, it's hard for this dialogue to ever take place and engage. I was able to ask Kenneth Hammond if he would be interested in talking to Uyghur refugees and to see if there's any hope of dialogue on this camp. I know it's a hard thing to ask someone who is not allowed in their home to talk to someone who is allowed there and says vile things about your movement. But is that a conversation you would also be willing to have and to see if there's any good to come of it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not afraid of engaging in dialogue with anyone. I mean, whether it's even the Chinese government official propagandists, if they can present their side, and I'll present the facts. And so the facts are there. He can talk, he can tout the Chinese propaganda all he wants, but that doesn't change the facts on the ground. The Chinese government itself, so earlier this year in February, a Chinese government, a CCP entity overseen by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, they published an article titled East Turkestan, West Turkestan, just tutu them all. Tutu is the Chinese word for machine gun them. And so in it, it praises, they don't even hide the genocidal, actions anymore. In fact, they glorify it. It's an article glorifying the initial, conquest of East Turkestan in the 1950s and how, Wang Zhen, he's the Chinese general who was sent to occupy and colonize East Turkestan, how he would massacre entire Uyghur villages, how they would bombard and kill everything that lived, how they would force Uyghurs to, raise pigs and eat them to humiliate them, because it's against our religion. And what if you and I can show you videos right now that are on Douyin where the Chinese are visiting Uyghurs and saying, "Oh, how's that pig that you're raising?" Uh, like not just one video, but dozens of videos like this. They're still doing this. How that if they had a law at that time stating that if there three or more Uyghur men gathered in one place, they should be executed on spot, no questions asked. How that even when our leaders were like, whoa, this is not what the nationality law that Mao promised us. This is not what we had agreed with. You know, they're like, oh, Wang Zhen was like, okay, yeah, I'll take you to Beijing so you can speak with Mao. And then as soon as the car took off, drive into the desert and just execute them. These are things that they're glorifying and stating that we need to bring these types of policies back. Like there's this is a like it's just like a think tank that is urging the government to even be more repressive, even more genocidal, saying you're not doing enough. And what do you say to that? This is not something that the CIA or someone else cooked up. This is not something I cooked up. This is words from the Chinese, propagandists themselves. They're no longer hiding it. If you look at the satellite imageries, like everything you can view from Google Earth, these massive prison complex that suddenly emerged post 2013, because from Google Earth you can view when it was built and when, and you can see the high barbed wire tires. There's 1,400 of them. If it was solely about imprisoning actual criminals and stuff, isn't that too much? 1,400 for a population that you say is only 11 million. You have 1,400 prisons for a population of 11 million people, and of that 1,400 prisons and camps, you officially your own judicial records show that you sentenced 580 78,500 of them to anywhere from 5 years to life imprisonment for various crimes. So what is that crime? Its crime is being Uyghur. That's what the crime is. Its crime is not being Chinese. That's our crime. Like if this professor is any what genuine, because a lot of Marxists claim that they're anti-colonialists, that they're against colonization, they're against imperialism. What China is doing is colonization. What China is doing is imperialism. China is not a state; it's an empire, and you, despite knowing all these facts, because this is all publicly available data, and I'm pretty sure he knows all of this. He knows it very well. He can't hide from the facts. He knows the facts. And the fact that he's hiding from it and he's still propagating it means either he's being paid by the Chinese, and that's part of the privileges, is that in exchange we'll give you money for your organization that he's part of, and you get to come to China. We'll give you we'll give you these beautiful tours, free stays, gifts, all these things that the Chinese regularly do to anyone that goes there. Like even a couple of months ago, what was that rap artist guy who went to who the Chinese took on a tour?
Was there a rapper who
Like
was taken on a Chinese tour? I'm trying to remember that, actually. I think I heard about that.
I forgot his name, but he's African American. He went on a tour to China, and again, you know, out of nowhere in the Beijing bus while he's doing it, randomly some random Uyghur comes up to him and says, "Oh, everything's great," like it's not scripted.
Yeah, no, a very natural interaction, that one, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'm trying to see if I could find out. Oh, are you talking about Tinashe? Is that who went there? I think so. Oh,
I
Kanye
forget.
went there for Vultures, I guess, too. Travis Scott went there. Okay, it looks like there's a lot of rappers they
Yeah, a
bring
lot
up.
of
This is a pretty big
the
effort they
Chinese
have.
government is waging a propaganda offensive right now, to deflect from its crimes. So it's bringing in a lot of um, uh, influencers, anyone that they can bring to China to state that everything is great and nothing bad is going on here, and that this is just as you stated everywhere. Everyone says, "Oh, this is just the CIA doing this, the CIA playing this." Like, I'll straight it up. I tell you guys, I have no ties to the CIA. If anything, the CIA has been working with China in a lot of things to undermine our independence movement. That's something I'll tell you right now. The CIA has been working and has worked with China in undermining our independence movement, not alone supporting us. If the CIA supported us, just think about it. Use your brain. If the CIA was supporting our cause in any way, if that happened, we would end. Our situation would either be like Ukraine's, that's where it would end up, or like the case of Syria or other places. That's where it would end up if the CIA genuinely was actually supporting us. And in contrary, and at the very least, here in the U.S., I can't even get certain bills and laws passed to get the recognition of our rightful status to self-determination, etc., because there are certain individuals, including groups like the CIA, who are opposing our efforts.
This is a cautionary tale of why you purchase your premium Zoom. When you don't, your Zoom meetings get cut off short and your guests got to go pick up their kids. Regardless, I think we had a pretty good conversation. Salih Hudayar is a refugee and an activist and one of the best voices for the East Turkestan movement. And I hope that we can get him in conversation with Kenneth Hammond, a professor who is very closely tied to the Party of Socialism and Liberation. We don't seem to be on the same page between those two people and these groups, these ideologies, and these messages. I think that's an important dialogue that needs to happen. It may not. Not everyone wants it to. But this is my best try on trying to get the truth told. Make of all of these facts of what you will. Research on your own, and always resist colonization. Here in New Mexico, that's one of our biggest priorities always.